So for today's session, we'll actually do a deep dive into DNS records. So we'll be taking a look at some of the more common records, the A records, quad A records, CNAME, canonical name records, MX records, and text records. So over here is actually the Cloudflare dashboard, and I'm actually using Cloudflare to manage my domain. So this is something that not many people have seen unless you really own a domain yourself. And I would really highly recommend that, because you can play around with set up your own web servers, point your domain to your web servers, have emails, your custom emails, things like that. So this is something that unless you purchase your own domain, which is not too expensive, I think it's about $10 a year. You most likely will not get to experience this at any large company, because it's a very small team of people managing the domains, and you'll not have the experience. So I would highly recommend if you are interested, to actually purchase your own domain and play around with things like that. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so in a previous video we actually oversimplified things in order to explain. So what we actually tried to do was, I think the home laptop was trying to connect to google.com. So over here at the bottom right, and we said that your home laptop would actually have to look up the IP address of google.com in order to connect. And we ran something like this, and we said that this is where Google is located at, and your ISP server would tell you this information. So the issue is really that so many people own domains. Google own domain, I own a domain as well, and there's so many ISPs in the world. And if I let's say I shift over my server and the IP address changes, I cannot possibly tell every single ISP server in the world. And so how it works is that your ISP actually returns you what is called a non-authoritative answer. So there's actually what is called a SOA, site of authority, which is where host, let's say the figure for that particular domain is located. So let's quickly take a look at what's the SOA for Google. And we immediately see that the SOA for Google is ns1.google.com or dnsadmin.google.com. And if we assume that this corporate network belongs to Google, that means that this DNS server here is ns1.google or dnsadmin.google, and this is the authority figure for the google.com domain. What this means is that if your ISP doesn't know or is unsure what's the IP address of Google, because the ISP cannot possibly know every single domain's IP address, and it may not be updated. So what you will do is, if it doesn't know, you will actually query Google over here, and then it will return the answer, and then it will serve you the answer. And your ISP will actually cache the answer as well, so that other people who are trying to search for the same domain, they don't have to make that round trip again. And actually all these figures over here, you see, I believe this is like some sort of a serial number that actually increments every time Google updates their record. And over here is things relating to caching. So how long the ISP is allowed to cache before they have to come and grab the record again. Okay, so let's take a look at what's the SOA for my domain. And obviously it's going to be Cloudflare. No surprises here. I've already mentioned earlier that I manage my domain with Cloudflare. And indeed, this is where we get the SOA. And so if the ISP is not sure where to get my domain's information, they go to Cloudflare. And this is the control panel where I set it up in Cloudflare. So Cloudflare knows what answer to give to the ISP. Okay, so let's quickly take a look at some of the records. So I think one of the most popular records will be A records. This is the address. And so if we wanted to visit, let's say this subdomain, dot my main domain itself, this is the address. So if we quickly do an NS lookup, no surprises here. We get the same exact address. Yeah. Okay, so if we were to edit, let's say I were to shift my server, this is where I can change the address. Okay. And then this is what is called a TTL, or time to live. So for some ISPs, let's say I put this behind a dynamic ISP, I may need to set a lower time to live because the IP changes very frequently. So things such as your residential IP, let's say you have IP camera, you might want to set this to a low time to live. And then you might have a script somewhere which will update this record on a regular basis, every 15 minutes or something like that, so that you can access your IP camera at any time of the day. So a lot of these DNS providers, they would actually have scripts. They will have tokens where you can actually run to update your latest public IP address. Yeah. So this is how A records work. So one thing is that if you are trying to set an A record for the root, you use add. This is a common thing. Yeah. So there's another kind of a record which is called a quad A record. And if you are using an IPv6 address instead of an IPv4 address, you need the quad A record over here. Yeah. Okay, so these are some of the more popular ones. So another one over here is a canonical name, so or CNAME for short. What this means is that if you try to visit www.limbenjamin.com, you actually be redirected to limbenjamin.com. You can actually even do a dig to show you, CNAME. And if you put in www, yeah, it tells you that it's actually a canonical name for this. So how I've actually set it up is I've actually redirected this over to GitHub, and this is how actually because I'm hosting my website on GitHub. So this is what I'm actually doing currently. Okay. So if we move over to MX record, we also covered this briefly in our previous video on pretending to be email server. So these are all the records that you would use if you want to send, if you're a mail server and you want to send an email to me. So what happens is that your email server will actually look up what is the MX record for my domain, and then you would send to one of these. And we have actually showed earlier. You can actually refer to the previous video that if you try to send an SMTP over here, you will not be asked to log in. Instead, it will tell you that if it's a valid address, if the mailbox has overflowed and there's no space, or you are sending from a trusted IP and things like that. So this is where it's configured, MX records, and we can actually also query this over here. Yeah, so it gives you exactly what is set up in here. So there are some numbers here, and this is actually the priority. So which are the higher priority servers to use and which are the low priorities. Doesn't really matter much, to be honest. Yeah. Okay, as we move down, we look at DMARC. So this is where I set up my DMARC as well. So if let's say you receive an email from me, or let's say your mail server receives an email from me, and then you want to find out that let's say the SPF has failed and things like that, the DKIM has failed, what to do. And this is where my DMARC actually says reject. So if SPF has failed, reject, things like that. Over here as well, you get things like DKIM. So actually this is my public DKIM key. So what happens is that my private key is actually set up in Google's email server already. So any email that I send out via Gmail, Google will use the private key to actually to sign it, and then you send it out to your mail server, and then your mail server would come to over here and download my public key. It would verify that that message, the signed message is legitimately signed, and then it would forward on to you. So this is how I set it up, in my DNS. And finally, we also have SPF. So if I were to send an email to you, or your mail server would actually check, who is allowed to send email on behalf of limbenjamin.com, and it says Google. So if it comes from any of these IP addresses belonging to Google, it's allowed. Otherwise, it's a hard fail or drop. And you also see something such as all these verification. And you can actually get all this if I were to just query a text record over here, and you actually see a lot of this verification. So how this works is that when I'm setting up my email on Google itself, inside the Google account there will be this random string of text, and they'll ask me to paste it into my DNS records. And the purpose of this is to verify that I actually own this domain. Otherwise, anybody can create an account in Google and then claim any domain. As long as the domain forwards their MX to Google, and then they can claim it. So it's not very secure in that sense. So that's about it for today, and I hope that it has been educational for you. Thank you.